Today, we welcome Emeritus Professor James Banks, the father of multicultural education, to our Global Citizenship Education interview series. Professor Banks is the Karen Linda Killinger Endowed Chair in Diversity Studies Emeritus at the University of Washington, Seattle. He was the founding director of the Center for Multicultural Education from 1992 to 2018, which was renamed the Banks Center for Educational Justice. He received the American Educational Resource Association Social Justice in Education Award in 2004 and the 2018 Lifetime Achievement Award from the National Association for Multicultural Education. Professor Banks is a past president of the National Council for the Social Studies and the American Educational Resource Association. He is a fellow of the American Educational Resource Association and an elected member of the National Academy of Education and the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. Professor Banks is a specialist in social studies education and multicultural education, and he has written or edited more than 20 books and 100 articles in these fields. His more recent edited book is Transforming Multicultural Education, Expanding Educational Opportunity, published in Teachers College Press in 2021. He edits the Multicultural Education series of books published by Teachers College Press, Columbia University. In 2021, there were more than 70 books published in the Multicultural Education series and others in various stages of development. So James, thank you for being here today. I must say that it is a real pleasure and an honor to have you here. I must also say that your line of work on multicultural education and citizenship, both local and global, has deeply informed several of my publications, particularly in relation to notions of learning democratic values, but also social justice and transformative pedagogy. So thank you very much for being here.
Well, thank you for inviting me. And it's really nice to participate in this series that you're doing.
Thank you very much. So all my guests here would get a straightforward question to begin the conversation. And for you, the first question is, what is multicultural education and how multicultural education connects to notions of global and local citizenship?
Well, that's a very good question, and I could talk about it for an hour to answer that question, but I obviously don't have an hour to answer it. So I'll give you kind of some brief ideas, and maybe we can expand upon those ideas. Multicultural education, I think we need to think about it first as an idea. It's a big idea. And the idea is basically to change the school culture so that we bring about equal educational opportunities for all students. Because some students have a more equal chance to learn in schools as they're currently structured than other students who are from other particular cultural, racial, and linguistic groups. For example, as a school are structured, African-American students, Latinx students in the United States have a more difficult chance to learn in schools as they're currently structured than, let's say, mainstream middle-class white students. So it's a concept, but it's also an educational movement designed to change schools to make them more equitable for students from diverse groups. And finally, I said it's an idea, it's a reform movement. It's also a process, because you can't implement multicultural education quickly, or it's a long process. And by the way, it's a process that never ends, because as one group attains equality, other groups enter, and refugees, immigrants, as they enter, they get less opportunity in the schools than other groups. So multicultural education is a continuing process. And I'll just respond briefly to give you an opportunity, if you want to ask me more, by leading to the second part of your question. Multicultural education is related to citizenship education because multicultural education tries to help builds upon the cultural identities of students. Because historically, what schools have done in the United States and Australia and in Canada, they've asked minority kids, immigrant students, to give up their cultural identities in order to embrace the national identity. So what multicultural education does, it honors and respects the cultural identities of students. And that's very important because we use that in multicultural education, their cultural identities, as a vehicle to improve instruction. And the reason it's important to talk about cultural identity, because I want to tie that to global citizenship education. So by recognizing their cultural identities, multicultural education also helps students to develop national identities and global identities. And one of the things I argue in my work is that students must develop their own cultural identity,
right,
before, and their national identity, before they can reach out to the global issues. And I'll give just one example. If you're an African-American kid in Seattle and you're struggling and you don't have equity in the schools, it's hard for you to identify with African-Americans in London. I mean, West Indian kids in London. Because you need to feel comfortable in your own identity. So multicultural education is tied to global citizenship education because it also helps students who develop global identities. I'm going to stop there in case you would like to expand on something else.
I think this is really interesting, and my understanding is that you foresee the fact that by developing an inner identity that starts from the local, then students that would be able to understand what's going on in the global. And I think it really, this ties with my second question to you, because I believe here we're talking about also education of life, a journey of life that students undertake while doing their studies. And I want to ask you a question about how multiculturalism and notions of citizenship relate to your journey as an educator in relation, of course, to your teachings and publications.
Wow, that is a big question. And my journey has been a long one, a challenging one, but also a rewarding one. I'd like to really talk about my growing up. I don't know if you knew that I grew up in apartheid in the South. I came of age during the civil rights, just prior to the highest points of the civil rights movement. So as a child in the 40s and 50s, I attended segregated apartheid schools in Marianna, Arkansas. Well, that was the nearest town. I was actually 9 miles from Marianna, Arkansas. So I grew up in the heart of segregation. And it was the growing up in that community and in that city, if you can call Marianna a city, it was a small town. I of course, grew up on a farm 9 miles from Marianna, Arkansas. But the segregation that I experienced as a child had a profound effect on my work as an educator and as a fifth grade teacher. For example, when I was a child, the textbook showed that the enslaved people were happy. And I thought, how could enslaved people be happy? Because the Black folks I know in my segregated community aren't happy. We did all kinds of things to indicate we weren't happy. For example, the water fountains, there were Black, colored water fountains and white water fountains. And we as children, to subterfuge the system, would occasionally taste white water when the authorities weren't looking. And then we concluded, wow, what a fraud. White water tastes just like colored water. We thought that white water maybe would be sweeter or taste better. Then, of course, as the white kids took up, when I first started school, a bus took them to school, but we had to walk. I had to walk about 5 miles to schools. And one of my most poignant memories is that when the school bus carrying the white students ran down the road, it splashed mud on us. That's a very poignant memory. I think the other memory that's, and I'll stop because I could go on for a long time, and then I'll tie how these experiences relate to my work. The other memory I had is that visiting the zoo. Every year, our kids from our school visited the Memphis Zoo in Memphis, Tennessee, which was about 60 miles from Marianna. And I remember we could only go on Thursdays to Memphis, to the zoo, because Thursday was Black Day. And whenever I think about that, I think I have poignant memories, but also nostalgic memories, because Memphis was the first real city that I ever visited.
Right.
So all of these kinds of experiences led me to study positionality, the happy slaves in the textbooks, the fact that there were only really, in addition to the happy slaves, in my textbooks, there were 3 famous Americans. There was George Washington Carver, the educator Booker T. Washington, and then there was a famous singer in the textbook, Marian Anderson. So there was Booker T. Washington, George Washington Carver, right, and Marian Anderson. And one of my questions as a child, why weren't there other Blacks in textbooks? Were there others who deserved to be? And what I concluded, so how did all of this affect my work in multicultural education? I wanted to change the image of Africa. I started out in Black studies, by the way, and I wanted to change the image of Blacks in textbooks, in curriculum. And because I understood that the image that are depicted in textbooks, for example, the happy slaves, was constructed by a Southern historian called Ulrich B. Phillips in 1918. And this became the framework for constructing the history of slavery. And so I drew up on the concept that came out of women's studies called positionality. And then I began in my work to do a lot of work of what I call knowledge construction. And that's one of the 5 dimensions of multicultural education I've constructed, knowledge construction, where students are enabled to study the points of view of different historians, study their background, their social class, and how are those experiences reflected in what they write? And so that became a major kind of factor in my work and in my writing. In my book, the book you mentioned is actually in Press, Transforming Multicultural Education. But my latest book that's actually been published is called Diversity, Transformative Knowledge, and Civic Action. And that's a collection of my papers dealing with citizenship education and global citizenship. I'll stop there in case you want to probe me on any of the notions I've mentioned so far.
Yeah, there is a lot to ask, but I want to try to explore with you your recent projects. You were mentioning just now your recent book. There is also the Transforming Multicultural Education, Expanding Educational Opportunity in Teachers College Press, as you said. You have been doing a lot of precious work, and I've been reading several of your publications, and I tried for our conversation today, while I was preparing for it, to try to take a note of crucial terms that you've been developing through your very important research work. And I have four. The first one, and of course we can discuss this together, the citizenship education dilemma. That's the first one. The learning democratic values, the transformative classroom, and then the failed citizenship. These are, to me, very important terms, very important concepts, of course, connected to notions of global citizenship education. Can you elaborate on this?
Right. I want to make sure I got them all. Citizenship education dilemma, transformative citizenship education, and then failed citizenship.
Yeah, you can choose. You can choose.
I'll elaborate on each. What I conceptualize, and I talk about that in my latest book is that's been published, is the book I mentioned earlier, and it's a collection of about 8 of my essay articles and one book chapter. But what I talk about is the citizenship education dilemma. What I mean by that is that in nations such as Japan, of course, in nations such as England and the United States, all of these democratic nations, we're teaching students about citizenship and democracy. And yet they are being educated within schools that are stratified among race, among social class. And of course, we see stratifications within the school and ability grouping, for example, so that the students then are observing the contradictions of democracy as they are being taught democracy. And that's what I mean about the citizenship education dilemma. And I think that we really need to help students see the contradictions between what they are studying and the reality they're living in. In terms of transformative citizenship education, I really think that's really important, because I think by transformative citizenship education, I mean helping students to develop the knowledge and the values that they need to participate in civic education in a ways that will challenge racism, sexism, and other stratifications so that they can participate in bringing about equality. In other words, what we see in societies throughout the world, whether they are Marxist, whether they are democratic societies, we see exclusion. Even though there's the rhetoric of democracy, there's really exclusion of different groups. So by transformative civic education, I mean a civic education that teach kids the knowledge they need to participate in action to make the nation state more democratic, more just, and more consistent with democratic ideals and democratic principles. I'll go on to failed citizenship unless you want me to elaborate on something else that I mentioned.
Oh, please, let's discuss the failed citizenship. Yeah.
I conceptualize this notion because what you see again throughout the world, the Uyghurs in China, the African Americans in the United States, the West Indians, many of whom in London, the Muslim students in France, you see that most of these groups do not experience full citizenship in their nation state. And I conceptualize that as failed citizenship. And what I point out in this conceptualization is that it's not a negative term to refer to the people who are victimized by failed citizenship, but rather it's a concept that talks about how the society, how the nation state present these groups from having full citizenship. And what then should the goals of civic education be in a global context? What we see, so I came up with a typology that includes failed citizenship, recognized citizenship, participatory citizenship, and transformative citizenship.
Right.
So that when some citizens have recognized citizenship, mainstream groups, but they often don't participate. We have, for example, in the last election in the United States, I don't have the exact percentage in front of me, but a large percentage of people did not participate. So we have citizens who are recognized and legitimate citizens who do not participate. Then I conceptualized participatory citizenship. And this is the kind of citizenship where people do participate. And that is, they participate in participatory citizenship within the laws and the rules of society.
Right.
But then I conceptualized transformative citizenship. And these are citizens who participate to challenge racist, unjust laws, even though they may be violating the laws. And I give as examples Gandhi in India, Martin Luther King, and of course, Rosa Parks, that they violated national laws in order to help actualize values such as human rights, social justice, and their efforts to eliminate institutionalized racism and discrimination. So this typology is aimed to help teachers conceptualize ways to see the various levels of citizenship.
Right, right. Very interesting. Thank you, James. And we are heading toward the end of this video interview. I want to ask you a question related to perspectives in terms of during and post COVID-19 situation. How do you foresee changes in education, both primary and secondary education, in terms of fostering our students in the context of globalization? What kind of pedagogical approaches do you foresee? What are the changes that you foresee based, of course, on your very long experience in education, both primary education and higher education?
I think one of the main things that we need to really accomplish is to help students understand multiple perspectives and from different cultures, from different groups, and from different nation states. For example, if you look at Afghanistan and the US participation there, I think one of the major problems in some of the wars in which the United States has participated is that we didn't have an understanding of the cultures of places like Afghanistan or Vietnam. So I think that we need to have a kind of cosmopolitan education, what some writers call it, where citizens throughout the world will understand each other. And I think to do that, we have to minimize ethnocentrism, and we have to emphasize cosmopolitanism to help students understand what cultures are like, how they differ. For example, I think if the United States had someone sitting at the table when they entered Afghanistan who really understood the cultures from the point of view of the participants and citizens of Afghanistan, we could have avoided many errors. I think the same is true when the United States ended up in Vietnam. I think as are the French, for example, in the 50s, when they explored countries in North Africa, that we need to really, Algeria, for example, the French in Algeria did not have a deep understanding of the Algerian culture and of the nation. So I think nation states, we need to educate students where they will be cosmopolitans, where they will understand not only the national journey, which a lot of nation states focus on. So we need a kind of education that expands nationalism, that expands, as important as I've argued that the cultural identities of students are, they need to be educated beyond their culture. They need to understand the different groups within their nations, but also the different groups within the world. Because we cannot solve, for example, global warming. We cannot solve the problems of racism, or sexism, homophobiaism. We cannot solve these problems within national boundaries. These problems have to be dealt with globally. And so we need, so I would say that educating students to be cosmopolitans, reaching beyond their own communities and their own nations to understand cultures far beyond. And also we need to help students understand that they cannot, that global understanding are also important to understand their own nations. If you live in the United States, much of your food comes from Mexico, for example, and other countries in the Americas, that we can't really truly understand our own national journeys unless we understand how that national experience intersects with other nations. So I would say global understanding, cosmopolitanism is really a high priority for the 21st century.
Very interesting. And this ties with the final question for our conversation dialogue today. And the question is, how would you define multicultural education and notions of global and local citizenship using 3 keywords, and why these 3 keywords? I know it's a challenging question, but let's try.
Yeah, no, I like the question actually, because I've actually thought about these issues and I was thinking of 3 words before you asked me.
Okay, great.
Yes, I've been writing about that this multicultural education and global education and global citizenship education require kids to know, to care, and to act. And those are and I've written about this issue because we gotta have knowledge. I mean, you can't take effective action unless you have knowledge. And when I talk about knowledge, I mean deep knowledge, not just knowledge from the US perspective or the Japanese perspective, but deep knowledge, that is multicultural knowledge, understanding perspectives from different groups, from different nations, from different races, from various genders. So that we need a deep knowledge, a complex knowledge, and knowledge that brings about a paradigm shift. For example, if US students look at the development of America from diverse perspectives, they would study not only the mainstream perspectives, but also the perspective of American Indians, the perspective of Mexican Americans. And I think that would be true in other nations. And I think it's very important for this deep knowledge, again, know, caring, and acting, this deep knowledge to be multicultural, to reflect different nations, different cultures. So to know, and I'm thinking about, and also that knowledge needs to be reliable scientific knowledge. It just can't be my opinion versus your opinion. Caring, to know, to care, and to act. we need to care, because if we know and don't act to care, I mean, look how knowledgeable Germany was during the Holocaust. It was a very knowledgeable society,
Right.
but we also need to balance to integrate the knowing, the knowledge with caring. We need to care, and that is values education. How do we help our students develop empathy for other people? So we need to care. We need to teach understanding and empathy. And finally, in the third word is we need to teach students how to act, to know, to care, and to act in their communities, within their nation, and also on the global scale. So I think those three words are really important to build into both multicultural education and global citizenship education: to know, to care, and to act.
To know, to care, and to act. Very interesting, very interesting. Thank you so much. Well, it was a wonderful conversation. We discussed a very interesting notion, including citizenship education dilemma, learning for democratic values. We also discussed transformative citizenship, and of course, your three key and core words when we discuss about multicultural education: to know, to care, and to act. It was a very important discussion. So I want to thank James Banks for taking time to join Global Citizenship Education interview series. We had several guests here, several educators, and I must say, every time I discover something new, and it is really precious. So thank you very much, James. It was a pleasure.
And thank you for inviting me.